All right, I think you're gonna have to click though. So that's right. So you go to the next one, Chris. So you went too far. Our entire goal is for you guys to get some sort of better understanding of the anatomy and physiology, and after speaking, it sounds like some of the electrophysiology of the heart. So a lot of this is going to be review, hopefully. For some of you, maybe not. I don't know what you've covered in your A&P classes. So we're going to do some basic anatomy review, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the electrical system of the heart actually works. And then we're going to talk kind of about why and how we correlate that onto the EKG that we look at quite regularly. So I wish I could click on your screen, Chris.
Gotcha. There we go.
Good. So we'll do a brief anatomy review. So as we all know, obviously we have to start every class with anatomy review. Arteries, we all know, carry blood away from the heart. Arteries then turn into arterioles and become capillaries, and the capillaries become venules, and then they eventually become veins. So arteries, much more muscular than a vein. Typically veins are depicted in blue on an anatomy picture and red for arteries. Our capillaries are the blending. As you know, the exception to this should be the pulmonary circuit, where the pulmonary vein and the pulmonary artery.
Stand by, Kyle. We got straggler here.
How about it? All right, go next one. All right, so just a brief picture, just some basic descriptions. So we have, essentially you're going to hear us talk about, or hear me at least talk about, the two pumps, which is something we're going to talk about. You have two pumps and you have essentially two vascular systems. If you think about it that way, it kind of correlates things a little bit better, where you have your pulmonary vasculature and your pulmonary circuit, and then you have your systemic vasculature and systemic circuit. Next. Sorry if you hear dogs, my dog is crazy. So your heart, about the size of your fist, located just to the left of your sternum. We all know that. The labeling of the heart is opposite of where everybody would think, though. So the base of the heart is actually on the top, where the apex is the point, which is on the bottom of the heart. When we start talking about different areas of the heart, you'll hear us refer to the inferior wall of the ventricles. That we're actually referring to the apex of the heart. So terminology a little bit different. The point is at the bottom and the flattest spot is to the top. As I mentioned before, the heart is one organ, but it's easier to think about it as two separate pumps. You have a left pump and a right pump. They work hand in hand with each other, but they actually are working to perform slightly different tasks. So we know the right side of our heart is where the blood from our body is returned to that right atrium. It then pumps it out through the right ventricle into the lungs for gas exchange to happen, for the offloading of CO2 and other waste, and the onboarding of oxygen onto the hemoglobin. Sorry, don't see the chat anymore. The left side of the heart.
Yeah, she's in trouble.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
The left side of the heart is, pumping blood from the lungs out to the systemic vasculature for exchange in tissues, where we get our actual perfusion and our cellular respiration to happen. The heart wall itself, 3 layers. Starting from the outside going in, we have the epicardium. So that's just the same layer as the visceral pericardium. So that's a thin outer lining of the actual muscle tissue itself. Then you have the myocardium. That's the actual muscle tissue of the heart. That's something we're going to talk about a little bit when we talk about these cardiac myocytes, which are the actual functional units of the heart muscle. Then you have the endocardium. That's just an epithelial lining within the heart. So keep in mind, the heart does not get blood from within the heart. It's a sealed off circuit. It has to get its blood from the circulation, the coronary arteries that go on top of it. So the inside of the heart, the endocardium, that's just epithelial cells that line the inside. So as you go through A&P, if you haven't found out yet, endo and epi, endo meaning inside, epi meaning outside. And then on the next slide, you're going to see there's even another layer outside of the heart, which is the pericardium. The pericardium is a really fibrous sac. It has minimal stretchability to it, which is one of the things in medicine that we we worry about when people have a medical condition that's affecting the fluid that's built up in that pericardial space because it only stretches so far and it starts putting pressure inwards. So you have two layers. You have the serous and the visceral. So visceral always is lined to an organ or the inside of the body, and then you have the parietal, which is the outside. In between those two layers, you have a cavity, a space which has some fluid in it, which is going to prevent friction and rubbing from the actual heart rubbing on the pericardium, because as you can imagine, muscle that is rubbing on something that's fibrous and rough would cause a lot of damage, a lot of irritation, a lot of swelling. So just a little picture to show you the couple layers here. So the heart chamber, that's the inside of the heart, which has that endocardium lining it. A note here is that the electrical system that we're going to talk about actually lives within the endocardium. We then have the myocardium, which those are our cardiac muscle cells, those intercalated discs we're going to talk about. Then you have the epicardium on the outside. You have that little space between the epicardium and the actual pericardial sac with that fluid in there. So an important thing to remember here is the electrical system actually lives deep within the muscle tissue of the heart, right at the endocardium. It's actually in between the endocardium and the myocardium is where the electrical system lives. But the blood supply to the heart muscle itself lies on the outside or the epicardium. So we talk about electrical system and blood flow, they're coming from different places. So if you have a blood flow problem that is actually affecting the electrical system of the heart, keep in mind how much damage has happened because it had to travel all the way through that thick myocardial layer. So once you get an electrical abnormality from damaged tissue, dead tissue, that's a pretty, we call it transmural. So that's when the injury has gone completely through that myocardial layer.
Kyle, not to add a quick little snippet here, but I just wanted to add a quick mic drop. Lead AVR. Boom. It's coming. It's coming.
I'm letting you get to that. So how are you doing this one?
I think gotcha.
All right, so internal anatomy, in speaking the other day, we talked about how you guys, like in every other A&P class, you have to memorize the 4 chambers and all the valves and where the blood flows and, stuff that I've done in every class I've ever taken and I could recite in my sleep. But we still got to remember there are 4 chambers within the heart. There's a right and a left atria and a right and a left ventricle. Those chambers are separated by these septums. You have the interatrial and the interventricular septum. That is that wall in between that separates the left from the right side of the heart. Yet again, talking about the right pump and the left pump. Even though the atria work at the same time and the ventricles work at the same time, the left and the right are still working to perform slightly different tasks, just at the same time. So atria, the atria are the entryways to the pump. Think of an atrium of a building. The atrium of any building is the area that everybody walks into. That's the receiving area. Those walls are really thin. It's really low pressure. That's where we're receiving the blood. So the right side of the heart is receiving the blood. Well, that's written wrong. So the right side of the heart is receiving blood from the vena cava. The left side of the heart is receiving blood from the pulmonary vein. So that right and left are opposite on that slide there. I apologize for that. So right side of the heart receiving blood from the vena cava, right where the superior and inferior vena cava meet, there's actually an opening directly into the right atrium. So it's a passive flow. If you know anything about blood pressure and everything like that, normal blood pressure, we're looking at that whole 120/70, 120/80 range. The amount of pressure inside that right atrium is only about 2 to 5 millimeters of mercury. So we're dealing with such low pressure and just passive movement of blood. And as you go through the heart, the pressure gets even more. So, low pressure from the right atrium, right ventricle has a little bit more pressure, pulmonary circuit, and then it increases all the way until we're leaving the body where we have the top number of systolic blood pressure is actually the pressure that right ventricle is squeezing at when it's at the end of its contraction. Go ahead, Chris. So our ventricles, higher pressure. especially the left ventricle, is much higher pressure. The right ventricle, I can't see the whole screen here, but the right ventricle, that's receiving the blood from the right atrium. So that's the blood that comes from the body back to the heart. That right ventricle is responsible for squeezing that blood out and through that pulmonary circuit to allow gas exchange to happen. The left ventricle, that has to squeeze blood out to the entire body. So therefore, the left ventricle is much more muscular than the right ventricle. The right ventricle relies a lot on stretch, something we call Starling's principle or Starling's law, where the greater the muscle is stretched, the more it'll spring back and the more blood it will eject out of it. So that right ventricle relies a lot on that, a little bit on muscle, where the left ventricle relies a lot on muscular contraction. It has to be able to squeeze. It has to overcome the pressure in the resting pressure in our arteries to generate that movement of blood. So valves, everybody loves valves. There's two sets of valves. The whole purpose is to keep blood flowing in the right direction. If blood was flowing backwards through our heart, you can imagine what a terrible thing that would be because you wouldn't be alive. Blood has to flow in that forward movement pattern in order for proper gas exchange and proper delivery of oxygenated blood out to the body. Because quick on this, you're going to see that the first one we talk about here should be the AV valve. So the arterial ventricular valve. So these are the valves that are between the atria and the ventricle, hence AV, atrioventricular. They separate the atria from the ventricle. So when the atria squeezes blood down slightly, and the ventricle relaxes, which actually creates a vacuum, the ventricles are going to suck down about 80% of the blood they need to fill just based on their expansion. The atria are going to provide about 20% of the filling of the ventricles by that muscular squeeze. But when we said before, they're extremely, extremely thin, so they don't have a lot of muscular ability. So if you think about that, when the atria squeeze, they don't have a whole lot of ability to squeeze and pressure. If we didn't have the valves, when that ventricle squeeze, it would very easily go back up and fill up those atria. So we need these valves. So on the right, we have the tricuspid valve, which is, that's actually backwards. So the right has the tricuspid valve. So it's got three cuffs. So they're like three little leaves. Sometimes we call them leaflet valves. And they're held down with these tendons that connect it to the myocardium. So when the atria squeeze, it allows them to open and the blood to move into the ventricles. But once that ventricle starts to squeeze, it causes those valves to snap shut. So something to keep in mind is there is a slight period of time while that ventricle starts to squeeze to build up pressure where those valves are open, and you get a little bit of blood that goes back in, but it's nothing crazy. It causes those valves to shut. Essentially, it's like little triangles that snap together. On the left, you have the bicuspid valve, which only has two, also known as a mitral valve. This should say more pressure needs less cuffs. We will have less cuffs because it's higher pressure. We don't want all that surface area and all that stuff to be at risk for damage. That mitral valve on the left side of the heart, I mentioned that the blood can move back into the atria sometimes. It does it a little bit. If too much moves back into the atria, we have a condition called mitral regurgitation or mitral valve regurgitation. This is actually what heart murmur typically is that mitral valve regurgitation that people are experiencing. As they get older, if they have that, that can become a serious problem. It can actually lead to them needing a valve replacement because as the heart is squeezing really hard, trying to overcome diseased blood vessels, if that valve is leaking, it can actually cause too much blood to go back up and not enough blood to go out to the body. So these valves are extremely important. Then we have our semilunar valve, when Chris goes here. So our semilunar valves, the other ones we talked about them being like leaves. These are like little tissue cups. So what these do are they're cups that sit together, and then as there's pressure behind them, it causes those cups to empty and the valve to essentially spread itself open. So when the ventricles squeeze, blood moves through and it opens these valves. But as the ventricles relax, that slight backflow of blood causes those cups to fill back up and close against each other. So we have our pulmonary semilunar valve, or some people call this the pulmonic valve. That comes from our right ventricle going out to our lungs. Then we have the aortic semilunar valve coming from our left ventricle at the base of our aorta. where, that's the going back out to the body. One of the really important things about this aortic semilunar valve is just above that valve on the aorta is where our coronary arteries come off. So your coronary arteries come off right where these valves are. And if you think about what we said before, that backflow of blood, that blood backflows slightly and causes those valves to fill up, that's also when it causes the blood to go down the coronary arteries. Because our coronary arteries receive blood while the heart is at rest, while the heart is filling. When our heart contracts, it can actually close down those coronary arteries from the pressure. So you need that backflow, that passive filling down those coronary arteries to perfuse the heart tissue with the blood it needs to perform its vital function. Just a little picture of our valves here. You can see the tricuspid valve and the three little leaves there. The bicuspid has two. Then you see your semilunar valves, which have like those little cups that fill up. So blood flow through the heart, something that everybody loves. So we know blood comes from the body, goes to the right atrium, goes through the tricuspid valve, goes to the right ventricle, leaves through the pulmonary semilunar valve, goes down the pulmonary artery, through the lungs, back to the pulmonary vein, back to the left atrium, through the bicuspid valve, to the left ventricle, through the aortic valve, to the aorta, to the body. As I told you, I've had to repeat that numerous times in every class I've ever been to, so it's that easy to rattle off, but it can be somewhat complex to remember sometimes. So if you look here, just to review a couple of things we talked about, if you look at that right atrium, I don't think Chris, point to the right atrium real quick. Up a little high, yeah. If you look at that right atrium up there, that little hole at the base there, that is actually where the vena cava allows the blood to passively come in. Then that tricuspid valve there is held down with those tendons, that cordon tendineae, which allow it, when it closes, it prevents that valve from completely going back up inside of itself and regurgitating. Then you see your semilunar valves. You can see how the left ventricle is much thicker than the right ventricle. Remember, when we're looking at stuff anatomy-wise, we're thinking the patient's left, not our left. So everything is opposite. So on the right side of your screen is actually left ventricle, and on the left side of your, is that right? On the right side of your screen is the left ventricle, and on the left side of your screen is the right ventricle. All right, go to the next one, Chris. So we're more than willing to send this presentation out to you guys afterwards. But this is just talking about, what the right side of the heart, what the right pump does, what the left pump does. So if you haven't noticed, I'm repetitively talking about it being two pumps because they're performing two slightly different functions. They have two different goals, even though it all goes together to form one overall goal. Next one. So coronary arteries, if you're getting into medicine, which is one of the things that I know when I was building my section of this, was to focus on how this is going to apply to your practice in medicine and in healthcare. So one of the things we look at and worry about in, I can say, especially the emergency setting, and even the non-emergent setting, is the coronary arteries. So we said before, these receive their blood off the base of the aorta when the heart relaxes. The heart relaxes, starts to go to diastole, relaxes, slight backflow of blood, causes the blood to go in the coronary arteries. That is as oxygen-rich blood as you can get. That is blood before it has gone anywhere else in the body. The heart is getting it first. So these arteries, they come off. You have the right and the left, obviously on the anatomical right or the anatomical left. They continuously divide into smaller and smaller vessels. They form a web of all these interconnections to supply blood to the heart. We have these anastomosis all over the place, which are just dense areas of blood vessels that are kind of all blended together. So when you hear about people having, a coronary or a myocardial infarction, death of heart tissue, it typically involves one of the larger coronary arteries being blocked. If one of the smaller, little teeny tiny ones is blocked, we're only blocking blood flow off to a slight area. And there's so much other circulation in there, it's typically minimal impact to the heart. But if we block off one of the larger parts of the coronary arteries before it divides and divides and divides into smaller pieces, we're affecting a much larger area, and that can be catastrophic to somebody's heart tissue. because as you learned in cellular anatomy, I'm sure you learned that you need oxygen and glucose to convert into ATP to become a usable form of energy. So we really need to make sure that oxygen and that glucose are getting to the heart cells as well, even though we don't think of the heart as using glucose. It does. All cells do. We're going to talk a lot about ions and electrolytes in a minute, but that applies more to the electrical conduction of the heart. In order for them to make ATP a usable form of energy, they still need the supplies to make that ATP. So our right coronary artery, it goes down, it feeds the right side of the heart, that right ventricle. And we said before that right ventricle, not very thick and heavy, full of muscle. So it relies a lot on stretch. That right coronary artery also feeds the posterior portion of the heart, some parts of the inferior portion of the heart, which would actually be the apex, like we talked about before, and the interventricular septum. Really important when we talk about the electrical conduction system. In the interventricular septum is where the electrical connection between the atria and the ventricles actually is. So this right coronary artery is actually feeding the atrioventricular node, the AV node, which is actually, I would say, more significant than the fact that it's supplying the right ventricle. We said that right ventricle relies a lot on stretch. So blockage of the right coronary artery can be bad, usually is bad, but if that blocks the blood supply to that AV node, that's when we can wind up with these electrical abnormalities, which can cause even more complications with what's going on with them. Left coronary artery, this supplies the left ventricle. That left ventricle is what handles all the pumping. You got that on the screen there, Chris. The left ventricle is what supplies all that pumping out to the body. So if you look here, on the, I'll go back to where you were, Chris. Go back. So on the left side of your screen, you can see, obviously we said, you know, arteries are typically red, veins are typically blue. Where you have an artery, you typically have a vein. It also applies in the heart as well. So the right coronary artery comes down the right side of the heart, the left coronary artery comes down, it splits itself into what we are termed the left anterior descending artery, the one that goes straight down the heart to that inferior wall, and it also splits into the left circumflex coronary artery, which circles around to the back side of the heart. You see they feed the back side of the heart. In the back side of the heart here, we also have that big blue vein that's right there. That's our coronary sinus. That is where blood used by the actual heart cells is returned and goes into the right atrium of the heart in order to be reoxygenated again. So the heart's blood circuit actually comes, as we said, from the aorta right by the heart and returns directly to the heart. So it keeps it nice and close-knit and closed circuit.
So Kyle, if I may. So guys, I just want to stop real quick and see if anybody has any questions so far. Let me just open up the chat here. If anybody has. What was that, Kyle? Sorry.
I said, or they can talk.
Oh yeah, please, guys. So unmute if you guys have any questions. Anything. Oh, cool. Thanks, Ariana.
Thanks. So we're not trying to bore you guys to death either. We know you got some of this, but we want to make sure that you're understanding. So if there's no questions, we'll talk about conduction. This is where things are really going to come into play in medical practice. So go ahead, Chris. There may be some questions after this part, probably from Chris. So cardiac muscle, remember, cardiac muscle is made of its own kind of tissue. Skeletal muscle is different from cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle is different from cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is made of these intercalated discs. There's small connections that join those muscle cells together. In between them, they have what are called gap junctions. These allow transfer of that electricity from one cell to the other. So cardiac cells talk to each other. If one cell has a signal, it is going to give that signal to the next cell. So click here, Chris, for me. I think there's an image here. So if you look here, in those cells, you can see how you look over to the right, you can see how they're all connected and they have those gap junctions. So that's why if one cell gets an electrical stimulus, it is going to transmit that electrical stimulus to all of its neighbors. And those neighbors are going to transmit it to all of their neighbors and all of their neighbors. So essentially, if one cell in the center has an electrical impulse, it's going to be like a firework, a 360-degree firework exploding that electrical impulse in an outward fashion. You can go to the next, Chris. So cardiac muscle can contract without a nerve impulse or without hormonal influence. Nerve impulse and hormonal influence do impact the pacemaker sites of the heart, but any cardiac muscle cell can decide to stimulate its activity on its own. As long as it is sitting in a resting charge state, it can decide it's going to depolarize and fire off and do its job on its own. But keep in mind, we said they're all connected to each other. So if one random cell in there decides it's going to just do its own thing, it's going to communicate that signal to all of its neighbors and get them to start doing their own thing, which could drastically throw things out of whack. So because this uncontrolled contraction and depolarization could be really bad, there's specialized cells that are designed to stimulate the electrical impulse that starts the heart and transmit it to other portions of the heart. So those are our nodes and our internodal pathways in our bundle. They're essentially like insulated wires. They're not actually insulated wires, but they're like an insulated wire that allow electricity to travel down them to get to the locations they need to be at, rather than just talking neighbor to neighbor to neighbor. So these allow it to go to where they need to start, get those cells the information and the information to depolarize, and then have those cells deliver it to their neighbor. So that way we get that firework effect in the right direction, rather than just completely chaotic. So our electrical pathway, we have our pacemaker cells, also known as our nodal cells. So these are the cells that are supposed to control the rate of the heart. This is where the electrical impulse is supposed to start. And it's supposed to happen at a regular rate. You'll hear us use the term intrinsic. Chris will probably talk about intrinsic rates when he gets to normal firing rates of different places. So he even mentioned it here. So there's two groups of nodes, actually two nodes, but they're groups of tissue. It's not a single cell. A node is not a single cardiac cell, but a group of cardiac cells designed to perform this function. So our SA or sinoatrial nodes, they live right in the top of the right atrium, kind of where that vena cava comes into the heart. And that should stimulate electrical impulse at about 60 to 100 beats per minute. Some books you see may say 70 to 90, but 60 to 100 is that normal range. So this sinoatrial node should fire off about once a second. Can it go faster? Yes, it can. Nerve connection does occur to the SA node. So if you get scared, if you have an increase in your sympathetic nervous system, that's going to contact the SA node and tell it to fire faster. If your body has a lack of oxygen, the nerve impulse is going to tell that sinus atrial node to fire faster. If you have an increase in your parasympathetic system, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, innervates that SA node and is going to tell that SA node to fire slower. So it could wind up firing slower than 60 beats a minute. But this node where it's sitting without any nerve or hormonal influence should fire at 60 to 100 beats per minute. Your AV node, which is between your atrial and your ventricles, hence AV node, kind of at the base of the right atrium, it's right at the top of the septum. And when we were talking about these before, these are the cells that live right at that myo region. We said the electrical conduction lives in that endocardial area. So your AV node is the connection between the atrial and ventricles to the electrical pathway, which any impulse from the SA node is should travel through the AV node if things are going the right way. But the AV node is also a pacemaker site in the event that the SA node doesn't work. So we have a backup system. If that AV node becomes a pacemaker, that's going to fire at about 40 to 60 beats a minute. So essentially what's happening here is we said that SA node should fire at 60 to 100 beats per minute. But if for some reason it fails to fire at that rate, your AV node should fire off between that 40 to 60 range to keep your heart rate at least above 40. Good, Chris? So once the impulse generated by the SA node is transmitted to the AV node, so it goes around the atrium and through these infranodal pathways. So once it reaches the AV node, it kind of pauses a little bit. So that allows those atria to contract. The AV node is kind of like the toll booth. We have all this electrical traffic coming around and it has to go through this one way to get to the ventricle. So once it gets to the AV node, it kind of slows down and gets held up for a second, allows everything to regroup, and then it's going to go down to the AV bundle, also known as the bundle of His. So we have this node that comes into a single road coming out of it, like a toll booth. Everybody merges together and comes out in a smaller line. So that AV bundle, or the bundle of His, is then going to split in that interventricular septum, that wall between the two ventricles. Then it's going to travel down along the inside of the ventricles in that endocardial area, and it's going to split, and one side is going to go to the right side of the heart, one's going to the left side of the heart. The left one is actually going to split again and go to the front and the back and the bottom of the heart. That left ventricle pumps the blood out to the body. We need that to squeeze in a nice organized fashion, so there's going to be a lot more electrical pathways going that direction. Then it's going to get to the Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers are actually what come off of these electrical pathways and bury themselves into the myocardium. So if everything goes right, electricity is going to travel down these pathways and not touch any of the heart cells until these Purkinje fibers in the ventricles, which is going to cause that heart to squeeze in a nice upward and inward fashion. Since the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve are on top, it's going to squeeze those ventricles up and in to force the blood out through those semilunar valves to the location it needs to go. So a little picture here, you can see the SA node on the top there. There's intranodal pathways. It's also going to travel, it's through that Bachman's bundle and over that atrium. We want those atria to squeeze down and in at the same time, and want the ventricles to squeeze up and in at the same time. So that SA node then comes down to that AV node, to that bundle of His, where you see it split into the right and to the left bundle branches. And at the end, with those Purkinje fibers, you can see they branch out and actually go into that myocardial tissue in order to give the electrical activity where it needs to originate, where it needs to originate. Any questions on that before we talk about the actual electrical physiology? That was more the anatomy of the electrical system. Okay, we're moving along here pretty well. Okay. There's going to be a lot of stuff on these slides, and I apologize for that, but there's a lot there. So what we're going to talk about now is the ions. So electricity in the heart is based on the exchange of ions. The ion change is going to change the polarization or the charge of the cardiac cells. And that charge of cardiac cells is what actually causes them to contract. Those cells are just sitting there at rest, doing nothing. But once there's a change in electrical charge within the cell, that's what actually causes it to use the energy that it's made to contract. So we have a chemical potential, which has to do with gradient, and then we have the electrical potential, which has to do on ions. So a lot of things we're going to talk about are based on the ions themselves. So we have a transmembrane potential. That is the electrical potential, or the difference in voltage between the inside and the outside of the cardiac cell. What happens is we have a net movement of positive ions into the cell. We're going to talk about sodium, calcium, and potassium. Those positive ions, when they come into the cell, that's going to make the cell less negative. You understand why I said that in a second. We think that positive ions would make the cell positive, but it really doesn't make the cell positive because the cell lives at a negative charge. So it'll make it less negative. As positive ions move out of a cell, that transmembrane potential will become more negative. So it all has to do with these positive ions is what we're looking at. Ion channels in the actual membrane of those cells help keep these concentration gradients and charge differentials. There's very specialized channels on that membrane that allow things in and allow things out. So you can click next one, Chris. So these channels are fairly selective. They only let certain ions through. So we talk about a sodium channel. A sodium channel is only going to let sodium ions in. A calcium channel is only going to let calcium ions in. A potassium channel is only going to allow the movement of potassium ions, which those are the three big ions we're looking at when we talk about this electrical charge and electrical current of the heart. There's also time-dependent channels, which is really important. So sodium channels are very quick. So some channels, when they open for a lengthy period of time. A sodium channel is only open momentarily. So the other thing to keep in mind, we talk about it being open briefly or a channel being open longer. We're not talking about minutes. If the heart is firing at 60 beats per minute, it needs to perform its full change of electricity and reset within 1 second. So we're dealing with, fractions of a second for these channels to be open. So we talk about the sodium channel, those ones are open so short, it's an instantaneous change. And there also be a graphical representation to explain this in a little bit. So the next one, Chris. Action potential. Action potential is it's the sequence of events that happen to cause this depolarization. So our action potential is actually the action that the cell performs. Our cell has a resting action potential. We use the word action potential sometimes incorrectly because we talk about the action as action potential, but we're actually going to talk about the actual action that is happening when the cell decides to perform its task. So there's 5 phases of the cardiac cell performing its task, but it always begins and ends with phase 4. I didn't make this up. I didn't come up with this, so don't blame me for this being weird like this. So 5 phases, 0 through 4. 0 through 4, but they always begins and ends with phase 4. All right, go ahead, Chris. So phase 4, that is the resting phase. Our cell is at rest. We just said a little bit ago, I said a little bit ago, that a cell lives in a negative charge environment. So our cardiac cells live somewhere between -70 and -90 millivolts. There's a constant outward leaking of potassium, which is a positive ion, just to keep things kind of at rest and keep things normal. Sodium and calcium channels are closed. The cell is just sitting there, waiting for an impulse from one of its neighbors or one of its Purkinje fibers to tell it, hey, to do something. That electrical impulse it's going to get is not going to be an actual shock, but it's going to be the movement of sodium and potassium and calcium that are going to tell that next cell it needs to do what it needs to do. So phase 4, resting, nothing happening. This is where we begin and where we end, at rest. It's just like our lives. We begin our morning waking up from rest. We go to bed at night to get rest. Like this. So phase 0. This is when either a pacemaker site or a neighboring cell tells us we need to do what we need to do. So this is your alarm clock going off in the morning. It's telling you, hey, you got to wake up. So the first thing that happens is those really quick sodium channels open up one by one. And because there's a lot of sodium living outside of the cell and not as much inside the cell, we have a different concentration gradient. Based on that concentration gradient, sodium's going to want to move from an area of a lot to an area of a little to try to equal itself out. So by opening those channels, we're not using energy. The movement of that sodium doesn't take energy, but sodium is a positively charged ion. So we're going to take that cell from negative 90 millivolts, then we're going to increase it to about negative 70 millivolts. So we become less negative. That's why I didn't say we became positive. We become less negative than we were at rest. At about negative 70 millivolts, we close those rapid sodium channels, but there's still some sodium channels open, and they allow enough sodium to still kind of passively be coming in. We're now going to have a lot of sodium within the cell, which is going to put us at 0 millivolts or maybe even a little above that. So we've gone from negative 90 to roughly about 0. So during that phase, we've had a massive shift and change in our electrical current. So now we have these long opening calcium channels that are going to open. They open when our charge is about negative 40. So what we had is we were at negative 90. We opened the sodium channels. We got to negative 70. At negative 70, those rapidly opening and closing sodium channels close, but there's still some passive sodium channels open. We keep going up. Once we hit negative 40, our calcium channels then begin to open. And they're long openings, so they open for a longer period of time. So negative 90 rest, negative 70, negative 90 we're at rest, but we open sodium channels. At negative 70, our rapid sodium channels close, but there's still other sodium channels open. At negative 40, our calcium channels open. That's what's going to bring us up to that charge of 0 or even above 0. You can go to next, Chris. Phase 1. So what has happened here is the cell has had a change. It's gone from negative to 0. Going from negative to 0 is when the cell does its thing. That exchange of those positive ions coming in causes that cell to contract. The electrical stimulation of the heart is the change of these ions. We go from negative to a positive. So that is the actual electricity that happens within the cardiac cell. Now think about how many cardiac cells you have, and this guy telling their neighbor to do it. You're going to be able to measure electricity, which Chris is going to look at in a little bit. So that is a lot of cells. If you think about a heart attack, just to keep things in the principle, your average heart attack, 500 heart cells die a second. Our goal to get somebody into a cath lab is 90 minutes. So that just kind of puts into perspective how many heart cells you have. So this little bit of negative 90 millivolts to 0 millivolts multiplied by all those heart cells becomes a lot more exchanging of ions. So phase 0 was depolarization. We were at negative 90, so we were polarized. We went to 0, so now we are not polarized, we are depolarized. Our cell has performed its task, but it cannot perform another task now because things are not where they belong. So now our cell has to reset for the next phase. So we start that with our early repolarization, which is phase 1. So we said it's going to go to negative 90 or negative 90 to 0, and sometimes a little bit above 0. So at this point, we're a little bit above 0. Some of our potassium channels open briefly. And what that does is that allows some potassium to flow out. So we're at negative 90 to a little bit above 0. These open and it puts it at 0. So we've gone from a little bit positive to being at 0. That's why they call it early repolarization. Go ahead, Chris. Now we're going to go to phase 2. Phase 2 is what we call the plateau phase. Once you see the graphic for this, hopefully it makes a little bit more sense because I know this can get complicated. So our long-acting calcium channels are still open. There's a constant movement of calcium into the cell. Calcium is a 2 positive. So we have positive coming into the cell. But potassium is leaking out of the cell. There's a lot less potassium outside of the cell than in the cell. So with these channels open, the calcium's coming in, making it really positive. The potassium is leaving out of the cell. Hold on, I can't see. So they open at the question was, are the L-type calcium channels open in phase one? Yes. They begin to open at the end of phase one. Actually, if you go back, they open in phase one. Go back one more. So they begin to open at the end of phase zero, the very end of depolarization. So at the very end of depolarization, once we hit about what was it, negative 40, they open. So at negative 40, they open. And then it allows the calcium to continue to come in to continue to make that charge less negative. Go to phase one, Chris. In phase one, our sodium channels have primarily all closed for the most part. And our calcium channels are open, and our potassium channels open briefly. But our calcium channels are still open. That's where the longest was. The calcium is open the longest. Go back to phase two. So phase, oh, too far. Crazy finger.
Oh boy.
In phase two, those calcium channels are still open, which is allowing a constant movement of calcium in. So they're still open. There's still calcium coming in. Potassium channels are open. There's concentration allowing things to move outwards. And what this positive coming in and positive going out is going to do is going to hold things steady at about zero. So we've gone from negative 90 all the way above zero. We brought things back to zero, and we're going to hold it at zero a little bit by allowing calcium to come in and potassium to go out. So the next one, we'll go to phase three. So phase three is our true repolarization. So the channel's closed. Our sodium channel's already closed before. Our calcium channels are now going to become inactivated. I get this thing in my way here. Our calcium channels are going to become inactivated, and our goal is to get that cell back to that negative 90 millivolts where it was at rest, because at negative 90 is when that cell is able to perform its job again. So our normal concentrations our normal gradients start to return to normal. Sodium and calcium get returned back outside of the cell. Some of the calcium is absorbed into the endoplasmic reticulum, because some during depolarization actually comes from within the cell, out of the endoplasmic reticulum, but most of it comes from outside of the cell. And the potassium ions that were moved from within the cell to outside of the cell are then going to have to be returned back in. So the problem here, I wouldn't say problem, is everything before moved based on a concentration gradient. The principle of diffusion. Area of high concentration to low concentration based on either electricity or what the ion itself was. Now to get things back to where they go, that principle isn't going to work. So we need to utilize energy, ATP, the usable form of energy in the cells of our body, to activate these pumps. So we have the sodium and calcium exchanger, which is going to help put sodium and calcium outside of the cell. We have the calcium ATPase exchanger, and then the one that a lot of people hear about is the sodium potassium pump. The sodium potassium pump is actually the sodium potassium ATPase pump. So it's a 3-to-2 exchange. So we're using energy to get things back to where they need to go. Is the biggest principle here. So go ahead, Chris. Next one. So this is that resetting. So you can see where we have ATP dependent calcium pump, which is going to start pumping calcium back out of the cell. We have a sodium calcium exchanger, which is going to exchange sodium calcium back out. And then we have the sodium potassium pump, which is a 3-to-2 exchange. So it's not an equal 1-to-1 exchange. Go ahead, Chris. Hopefully this graphic helps you to make things make sense. If you've never seen this, this is called the action potential or cardiac depolarization curve. So we started at phase 0, and at phase 0 we said was rest. Sorry, phase 4. Phase 4 beginning end. Phase 4 beginning end. We then went to phase 0. That's where we had a lot of the sodium come in. We went from negative 90 then -70, then -40, we got those calcium channels that started to open. And then we get up a little bit above 0. And that's where we have that equal exchange of calcium coming in and some potassium going out. And then we came down to that plateau phase. At phase 2 is that plateau phase. You can see it's holding that charge right about 0. So phase 1 was that early repolarization, which got us from a positive back to 0. Phase 2, we're holding that charge of 0. Phase 3, we start going and we begin that repolarization phase. So that's where we move things back to where they go. Sodium out of the cell, calcium out of the cell, and potassium back into the cell. Once we get to a -90 millivolt charge, we're back in phase 4. And at phase 4, it's ready to go. So there's a couple, go back to that, Chris. There's a couple different ways we explain this in different places. Let's do this question. So sodium. Sodium is open during this phase, during phase 0. The question is, I'm trying to read into the question, but I always read into things way too much. Sodium channels open here, the rapid sodium channels open till that whole -70-ish range. There's still other sodium channels open throughout this. At -40, those calcium channels are going to open. There's still sodium channels open, still sodium channels open, still sodium channels open. So they are open, but then they close. So sodium is responsible for the initial phase of depolarization. The calcium is responsible for the continued phase of depolarization. So sodium gets things going, calcium keeps it going, and then the potassium is coming from within the cell. So if you look at the chart up at the top, it shows you that in phase 4, there's some leakage of potassium from within the cell out to the extracellular fluid. So intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid. There's some leakage of potassium from intracellular to extracellular, just keeping things kind of normal. Phase 0, lots of potassium coming in from the extracellular fluid to the intracellular fluid. The reason those channels open and close so quickly is there is a lot of potassium in blood. If you look at the normal lab values of what you're going to have in there, you're dealing with potassium. A normal value of potassium is 135 to 145. Normal value of...
You mean sodium, Kyle? Sorry.
Okay, yeah, sodium, sorry. Whoa, you wouldn't want to talking about. Normal value of sodium is 135 to 145. Normal value of calcium,
3.5 to 5, I think.
Yeah, that whole 5-ish range. And potassium, you're looking like 2 to 5. So you have a lot of potassium, so those channels don't have to be open that much. Think about when Apple's selling the newest iPhone. There's everybody at the door. As soon as they open the door, everybody's got to come in. So that's what happens with the sodium is every channel that opens is so flooded with sodium that it's able to rush in really rapidly because there's so much of it. Then we get to phase 1, that's the potassium going out. Phase 2, we have that calcium and potassium, so calcium, more calcium coming in, potassium going out. And then phase 3, we're shifting our potassium out of the cell, back into the cell, even though it says out. So we're shifting potassium back into the cell, we're shifting sodium and calcium back out of the cell. I hope that answered the question.
Kyle, I think I heard you say potassium when you did say calcium. I apologize.
There's so many,
but I'm just gonna correct that right now. So
what I think. So phase 4, potassium is just gradually leaking out through the rectifier cell. Phase 0, sodium comes in, those rapid channels close, sodium continues to come in, calcium channels now open. Your calcium channels are open and sodium channels are open. About here, our sodium channels are going to start closing, but calcium is still open. calcium channels are open and potassium starts leaking out. So we start to return back to zero. Calcium is still coming in and potassium is still going out to hold the normal charge. And at this point, we start resetting things back to normal. So sodium is being pushed out of the cell, calcium is being pushed out of the cell, and potassium is being returned into the cell. So I hope I clarified that.
I just pulled it up just for the sake of it. So if anybody's interested, so sodium's normal level 135 to 145 milliequivalents, potassium 3.5 to 5 milliequivalents, and then your calcium 8.5 to 10.2 milligrams per deciliter.
Yeah, and when you guys hear lab values, just so you know for future reference, different healthcare institutions have different normals for lab values. So Chris said for calcium, he just set up to 10.2. At the hospital I work at, 10.0 is our range for normal. 10.2 would actually be hypercalcium. Oh, no problem. Totally understandable. Thank you for coming while you did. You can click the next one, Chris. So important things to remember, cardiac cells are automatistic, which means that they can create an impulse and depolarize at any time that they want. So the normal things that are going to cause this are a lack of an impulse telling it to depolarize. So if a cell hasn't had an impulse for a normal period of time, it will decide it wants to do something. Cells that are irritable or deprived of oxygen or have an electrolyte abnormality can also depolarize on their own and start their action. So that could be bad because they are intercalated. So if one cell decides it's, hey, I'm angry and I want to do my own thing, it's going to communicate that to all of its neighbors as well. And that's where we end up getting arrhythmias. So keep that in mind, that those cells are intercalated and that they can any and all of them can fire off an impulse if they so choose. Like I say, they don't have a brain, so they're not choosing. So it's caused based on irritability, which is caused by CO2, lack of oxygen, or an electrolyte abnormality. I think we're getting you, Chris. I know that's a complex topic right there with the ions. I hope I made it make some sort of sense. If you have questions, we'll give you guys our email too, and you can always ask. If anybody has a really sick, twisted, deep interest in that stuff like I do, there's a very good book out there. It's called Ion Adventure in the Heartland. It's written by a man named Dale Dubin, who wrote the orange EKG book that everybody gets when they start learning EKG.
I actually have it right here, Kyle.
Ion Adventure, yeah, it's a very graphic, illustrated book that talks all about channels and ions and how they move. Really, really good. The cool thing about the channels, if you understand the channels and how they work in the cardiac cells, it's very similar with how they work in neurons, with the sodium. But neurons are less calcium dependent than the heart is. And muscles are even more calcium dependent than the heart. So each specialized cell has its own ion that it really, really relies on, where the heart, even though sodium seems like it's not open that long, it really relies on sodium to get that charge bumped up really fast.
Another question in the chat here, Kyle. Here we go. Comes this presentation actually going on YouTube or something for people to watch later? So Elena, thank you for asking that. Actually, yes, and just so I was going to talk about that afterwards, but just so everybody knows, our intention is to put this on YouTube, Facebook, what have you. But I just want to make sure that everybody attending tonight is okay with that, just because you guys are attending. So just shoot us a message in the chat. Make sure everything's cool and you guys don't mind, because we would love to get this out there to anybody that wants.
Yeah, we also, I can tell you, I know, I'm not sure if it was in a conversation with you, Elena, but we plan on, I plan on doing an EKG interpretation class. So Chris is going to talk about some EKG stuff here. I plan on doing an EKG interpretation video that we will hopefully get on our YouTube page and Facebook or whatever. if you have interest in learning the rules of actual what the different rhythms are and the causes of those rhythms.
And then, so not to get too deep into all of our plans here and give our top secrets away, but so Kyle's planning on doing that video. And then we also have one in the works right now, getting a little bit deeper into hemodynamics. So we're going to talk about different pressures. We're going to talk about what those different pressures mean, and we'll have that up for you guys sometime soon. But if also anybody watching, if there's any videos or topics that you guys want covered, just send us an email, send us a text, and we'll do our best to get that out for you. So,
if anybody has any questions, we do have a couple emails. I'll put it in the chat. I'll put this one here. info@voodoomed.net. That email actually goes to both Chris and myself. So feel free to email that one. And if you haven't been to voodoomed.net, take a look at it. We've done a lot of, up to this point, there's a lot of research-driven articles and writing about the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID and how it actually affects your body and what it's actually doing. Chris has put a lot of time in that. Spent a lot of time with some editing, and we've partnered with a few other groups, Hanson's Anatomy, which you may see some here. So there's another article there about cardiac axis deviation. So feel free, and there'll be more stuff to come there too.
So Kyle, do you mind switching to share your screen and clicking through for me? Is that cool?
You may want to click yourself. I find it harder to not click.
Gotcha. All right. All right. So everybody can hear me. So the next part we're going to do is EKG, or electrocardiography. So the beauty of EKG, or ECG now, is we can put everything that we just talked about into practice. We can see everything that we were just talking about.
That's just me.
Oh, okay, cool. So cardiac contraction is an electrical event, right? Oh, is there somebody in the chat?
That's me. Sorry.
Oh, cool. Is an electrical event. So that electrical event can be detected on the surface of the body, right? Using an EKG, using our leads. And we have 3 distinct waves representing the specific actions in the heart. So is everybody familiar with basic EKG interpretations so far, as far as P waves, QRS, T wave? If not, just say something. But the P wave is really that first part. It's the atria, right? It's the first wave representative of an impulse, but from the SA node, and depolarization from the atria down to the AV, all the way down to the Purkinje fibers. The P wave is where that starts. So the QRS complex represents the depolarization of the ventricles right before, the ventricles contract. So when I look at an EKG, I like to think about it. When I see a P wave, I think atria. QRS, I think ventricle. And then the T wave is that repolarization. So I kind of see it anatomically. I don't see it as a bunch of squiggly lines on a piece of paper. So because the ventricles are much larger than the atria, the repolarization of the atria is kind of lost in the QRS complex. That's why we don't have a T wave per se for the atria. I think I just skipped ahead a little bit there. I did. So like I just said, the repolarization of the atria is kind of overshadowed by the ventricle. And then there's a set range as far as height, depth, and length of time of all of these waves. We're going to get into that in a second. So when we look at those, changes to those set height, depth, and length of time is where we start to get cardiac arrhythmias. That's when all the different things start happening, when it doesn't really look right. So here we see our P wave. And like we were talking about, that's the atria contracting. Then the QRS complex correlates to the ventricles contracting. And then the T wave is preparation for the next beat. It's the repolarization, like we were talking about, the action potential, when everything kind of returns. So if you remember from when we were talking about action potential, here we're going to put that into text as far as EKG goes. So phase 4 here, right, when we're down at -90, and we're looking at sodium, calcium, those are closed, and then open potassium channels, right? And then rapid influx through the fast sodium channel. And then the transient potassium channels. And then the TMP, the transmembrane potential, returns, right? Starts coming down. And then phase 2, little plateau there, right? The influx of calcium. And then potassium kind of starts to balance things out a little bit. And then phase 3, start coming back. And the calcium channels close. And the TMP comes back to -90. So let's put this into text as far as, I'm sorry, Kyle, go ahead.
Just to note on this graphic representation, it's only talking about the depolarization of the ventricles. So this period also happens in the atria, but they didn't express it graphically for the P wave on this chart. Just so you understand that phase 4 being at rest, those atrial cells are not at rest during that P wave. They just, I don't know why they put it in here for this graph representation, but this is solely corresponding with the ventricle.
Cool. All right, so let's put this into a little bit more as far as EKGs go. So the ARP, the absolute refractory period, doesn't allow for any depolarizations. There's the ARP. When I was reading this and going back over everything, I was thinking ARP, AARP. No, wait, I'm not that old. And then you have the ERP here. And it may allow, or the effective refractory period may allow for some non-propagated depolarizations. But then you get into the RRP, the relative refractory period here, which also lines up with our T wave. And it allows stimulus from a really strong source to cause a full depolarization. So without getting too deep into that, just know if something like that happens, it can be pretty bad. RNT phenomenon, just something, if you want to read up on something really cool, check that out. So when I look at an EKG, and I have to give credit to Dr. Amal Mattu from ECG Weekly, but this is how I approach an EKG. 4 rules: rate, rhythm, intervals, axis. We're going to go over all of those things. So rate is measured by duration between complexes. Some people call it the R to R interval. And that's really how we kind of count them out as far as rate goes. But we're going to teach you a couple tricks to simplify that. So to determine rate, we need to understand all of the properties that go into an EKG, and never trust a computer's diagnosis. And when I say diagnosis, on the top of an EKG, the computer might say, this patient is having an acute myocardial infarction, when it could be completely sinus rhythm and just some artifact because you're bumping down the road at 70 miles an hour. However, the numbers on an EKG are super accurate because though there's nothing left to guess. So trust your own understanding of an EKG and the intervals. So the standard printing speed, this is important to understand because if it's slower or faster, it's actually going to change how the rates perceive. So the standard printing speed is 25 millimeters per second. And the paper that it prints out on is divided into boxes. And this is how we get that 25 millimeters per second. A small box is 1 millimeter and a large box is 5 millimeters. We have a graphic to show you that. So here's 1 second, 5 boxes. Here's 0.2. And then that little bitty box right there is 0.04. So the boxes also indicate amplitude, millimeter, or voltage, if you will, too. And that comes as far as height complex goes. So my favorite rule as far as determining rate is this method here. 300, 150, 100, 75, 60, 50, and then below that. So this, unfortunately, is rote memorization, but once you do, it's super easy to look at 3 to 4 complexes, find the complex that lines up mostly on this line here, on one of the big boxes, right? The complex that's most symmetrical, that line. And then from there, we're going to go over 300, 150, 100, 75, and 60. So here you have a rate of 60. Then there's the other method, the 6 second strip method. So if 5 boxes is 1 second, right? We need to take 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 large boxes, and there's our 6 second strip. So we have 6 seconds here to here. All we have to do there is count how many QRS complexes are within that 6 second strip. Multiply it by 10. You have a rough estimate of your rate. Cool. So to reiterate, 1 small box, 0.04 seconds. 5 small boxes is 1 large box, and 1 large box is 0.2 second. 5 large boxes is 1 second. And like the 2 methods we just went over as far as determining rate, the 300, 150, 100, 75, 60, and so on method, my preferred, just because I'm a numbers guy. That comes from rote memorization. And then you have your 6 second method, where you take those 30 large boxes, count how many complexes you have, and there's a rough estimate of your rate.
Just keep in mind with these box sizes and this time duration, especially the time duration, that you're going to have different people, especially in medicine, because we can't all do stuff the same because we're human beings, that are going to say these things differently. Where Chris may say 0.04 seconds, I will say 40 milliseconds. So keep in mind, these can also be interpreted as milliseconds. So 0.20 or 0.20 seconds, I will call 200 milliseconds. So just keep in mind that those decimals can be moved from seconds to milliseconds, normally our usual metric conversion tool.
Absolutely. So here's one example. There's actually some funky stuff going on with this rhythm, but that's for another time. So let's look at the rate first. So we're going to find the QRS complex that most lines up with one of our big boxes that's most symmetrical. And since that one's over here, okay, well, we'll go with this one. How about that? So plus or minus a small box. So we go over 300, 150, 100, 75, 60. Coincidentally, this is also a 6-second strip, right? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. So if we count how many complexes are there, there's 6 complexes, rate's about 60. So now we're going to get a little bit deeper into rate, but we're going to talk about inherent rates. So Kyle spent a lot of time talking about the SA node, the AV node, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. Each one of those parts of the heart have their own inherent rate. So as one fails to pace, so if the SA node really fails to pace the rest of the heart, something lower takes over. And normally that's the AV junction, that's the AV node. So our sinus, our SA node, our sinus rate, our inherent rate there is normally 60 to 100. Our AV inherent rate is 40 to 60 beats per minute. And then our inherent ventricular rate is 20 to 40. Now, this isn't in any way saying that there aren't such things as sinus tach, supraventricular tachycardia, ventricular tachycardia, junctional tach. We're going to get into those briefly, but these are just their inherent rates functioning as they should, if you will. And keep in mind, this is all based on a principle called overdrive pacing. So if something, say the sinus node, is functioning appropriately, it overdrives everything below it. But if this fails, this one takes over and it paces over here. So like we're just talking about a little bit, sinus rhythms come from the SA node, sinoatrial node. Sinus bradycardia is anything under 60 beats per minute. Sinus rhythm, 60 to 100. Sinus tachycardia, over 100. And then supraventricular tachycardia. Think about that, break that word down, supraventricular. It's coming from above the ventricle. We're not 100% sure where. Supraventricular tachycardia, 220 beats per minute minus the age in years. This is how I base my judgment on an SVT or supraventricular tachycardia. The AHA, as far as pediatrics, uses this formula. For adults, we normally use over 150, but it's entirely possible to have a sinus tach over 150 beats per minute. 220 minus the age just makes it a little bit more reliable to fully diagnose a true SVT or supraventricular tachycardia. Then we have our junctional rhythms. So remember that inherent rate is 40 to 60. A junctional rhythm comes from the AV junction. And the junctional bradycardia is under 40. An accelerated junctional rhythm, notice we're not going to call it junctional tachycardia just yet, is 60 to 100. And then our junctional tachycardia is over 100 beats per minute. And then the ventricular rhythms. So a ventricular rhythm comes from the ventricular pacemaker cells. So it might come from Purkinje fibers, might come from part of the bundle. But our ventricular escape rhythm is 20 to 40 beats per minute. And that's solely a ventricular rhythm. It's wide, it looks nasty. And then you have your accelerated ventricular rhythm, 40 to 100 beats per minute. Notice it's not called VTAC just yet. And then you have ventricular tachycardia, over 100 beats per minute. So let's talk a little bit about rhythm interpretation. So simply put, is it regular? Is it irregular? Is it regularly irregular? Or is it irregularly irregular? So remember when we talked about rate, we can take the R to R interval, we can take the two complexes and kind of judge our rate based on either a 6-second strip or the 300, 150, 100 rule. If they all don't march out evenly, it's an irregular rhythm. If they all march out regularly, meaning they have the same amount of spaces between them, it's a regular rhythm. But is there an irregularity somewhere on the EKG? Is there a P wave for every complex? And is there a complex for every P wave? Remember back, the P wave is the atria, the QRS is the ventricle. So if there's a P wave and no QRS, is that beat being conducted? Or if there's a complex and no P wave, where's that coming from? Cool. So here's a really cool and nasty example here. So we have our P waves, P waves, P wave, P wave, P wave, oh, P wave. Then you have your QRSs, US. So here's an example of really nasty rhythm, a 3rd degree heart block. Right? We're not going to get into rhythm interpretation entirely just yet, but let's measure this out here. So your QRS complex, 1 big box, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then give or take 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. So it's a regular rhythm, but it's slow and there's no irregularities. Not every QRS complex has a P wave close enough and corresponding with it. But there's also some P waves that don't have complexes. Here's another example. So let's go back to our rule of regularity, right? So, nice. Yeah, perfect, Kinsley. I'd say somewhere around there, yeah. So that was a 3rd degree AV block or a complete heart block, and those are traditionally super slow. Remember, the ventricular inherent rate is 20 to 40. And let me go back to that real quick for you. Yeah, probably 30 to 35, somewhere in there. Nice. Good call on that, Kinsley. So for this one, let's try to look at rate. So in completely chaotic and irregular rhythms like this, we can't really use the 300, 150, 100 rule, right? So we have to use that 6-second strip rule. So let's count out 30 big boxes. 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. Cool. So there is our 6-second strip. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 complexes there. So we can say the rate is probably somewhere around 90. However, because it's so irregular, we can't 100% be sure. So it's probably a sustained rate around 70 to 90, right? And now let's go to our next rule. Is there a P wave for every QRS? Is there a QRS for every P wave? No. So you see all this chaos here, right? This is atrial fibrillation. Cool. So we talked about rate, we talked about rhythm a bit. We're going to talk about intervals. And intervals do a great job of tying this all together. So your PR interval is 120 to 200 milliseconds. Your P wave duration, is under 120 milliseconds. Your QRS duration is 80 to 120 milliseconds. And then your QT interval is 330 to 440 milliseconds. So to put this back into 0.4 or point second, this would be 0.12 to 0.20, or 0.12 or 0.8 to 0.12, and then so on. So our intervals are really time-based. So here's our PR interval. The start of the P wave to the start of the QRS complex. And then our QRS complex, our QRS interval, exactly what it sounds like. Start of the Q wave to the end. The end is called the J point. Here's our R to R interval, the distance between, or the time between complexes. And then you have your QT interval. The beginning of the complex, the end of the T wave. So before we get into axis, let's talk about intervals just a little bit more. So if you have a prolonged QRS duration, just getting creative, what do you guys think that would mean? A prolonged QRS duration. So let's go back to our rules real quick. QRS duration is 80 to 120 milliseconds. So say you have a very wide QRS complex. We're looking at, say, 200 to 220 milliseconds. What do you guys think that would indicate? Nice. Very good, Elena. Slow ventricular depolarization. Good. Nice. It's taking a while for the ventricles to contract. Perfect. So could a wide QRS duration indicate a more ventricular dependent rhythm? Yes. So it's taking a while for the ventricles. Yes, because it has to generate the impulse and then act. Perfect. Nice, Kinsley. Very good. Yep. Very, very good. Cool. So the wider the duration, it's telling you something's not right, right? And then kind of have to play detective with EKG a little bit and think, what's making that complex be wide or narrow? Where's it coming from? So this is probably one of my favorite topics of all time, besides hyperkalemia, which Kyle and Elena will both tell you I'm a huge nerd about. And that comes from Kyle 100%. But Elena and I actually, for those of you guys don't know, Elena and I were partners for about a year. And Elena and I actually got to treat Hyper K a couple times. Super cool. I spark out hard about it. So next to Hyper K, Axis is probably one of my favorite topics. And that's because it's not covered very much. Kyle covers it, I cover it, and the people that are really worth their salt in medicine understand it. So, axis is the average direction of electrical activity. So if we think of the direction of that electrical impulse is coming from, right? You have the SA to the AV down to the bundles and out to the Purkinje fibers. So it's really traveling right to left, and then it's making those Purkinje fibers squeeze up and in, right? That's our axis. That's the direction of electrical impulse. So axis, by a rule, moves towards hypertrophy and away from injury. Let that sink in. Memorize that statement. Axis moves towards hypertrophy and away from injury. So just getting creative here without moving forward. Somebody that we haven't heard from yet. Why do you guys think that axis would move towards hypertrophy? It's moving towards a part of the heart that's getting bigger. Anyone? If anybody answers, I apologize. I'm gonna. Oh, there it goes. Wait, can you explain axis again? Audio. Oh, no problem. So, axis is the direction. It's the average direction of electrical activity. So, if we think about the SA node, it sits in the right atria. The electrical impulse starts there and starts traveling down towards the AV. So it travels right to left, right? Goes from the SA node to the AV node, down the bundle branches, out to the Purkinje fibers, right to left. So axis is the average direction of electrical activity, and it moves towards hypertrophy and away from injury. So, Ariana, just being creative, you don't have to give like a super scholarly answer here or anything. Why do you think that electrical impulse would travel towards hypertrophy, towards the enlarging of the pump muscle? Tell you what, Ariana, if you're working on an answer, I apologize. I'm going to keep moving, but if you write something in the chat or if you want to unmute and speak up, please feel free. Oh, there you go. Sorry. Is it because there's more space and nothing is damaged in those areas? So those areas can better. Nice, not bad. So there's more space and nothing is damaged. Perfect. It's because it takes the hypertrophy area. It takes a little bit longer to travel through that area. It has more places to depolarize as it goes, right? So it takes a little bit more time. So that electricity is going to naturally move towards that area because it needs a little bit more focus. If that makes sense. That's solid. So our normal axis is -30 to 90 degrees. And I say -30 because 0 to -30, it's still technically left axis, but it's physiologic left axis. That physiologic left axis is a place where normal people live as far as axis goes, and even some really healthy athletes will have a normal physiologic left axis. So our normal axis is -30 to 90. Our pathologic left axis, however, is -30 to 90 degrees. And bear with me on these numbers, guys, because we're going to get into a chart here real quick. Pathologic left axis, -30 to -90 degrees. And then we have an extreme right axis, -90 to 180. And then you have your right axis, 90 to 180. So now there's a really cool method for determining axis on the fly, and it's called the 2 thumbs method. So let's get into this chart here in 1 second. But I want you to imagine you have an EKG in front of you, and you have leads 1, 2, 3. You have AVR, which is the coolest lead ever. And then you have your precordial leads, right, on your EKG. You take leads 1 and leads 3. Now, make your left hand lead 1. Make your right hand lead 3. Next, if lead 1 is positive, meaning it's pointing up, leave your thumb up. But if lead 3 is pointed down, turn your thumb down. So 1 thumb up, 1 thumb down. Not bad. Remember this rule: left away, right together. So if the 2 complexes are pointing away from each other, not too bad, but we're looking at left axis, left away. So now you take the same rule and you look at leads 1 and lead 3, and lead 1 is down. So we're going to take our left hand and point it down. And lead 3 is up, left away, right together. We have a right axis deviation. So now what happens if both of them are pointed down? So we have the 2 where 1 thumbs up, 1 thumbs down, not too terribly bad. But what happens if we turn both thumbs down? That's extreme right axis. That's up here. That's bad. Cool. So that's the 2 thumbs up method. That's one of the first things I do. Obviously, the 4 rules here: rate, rhythm, intervals, axis. Extreme right axis, super bad. And here's why. Because look where that impulse is traveling. This way, right? If it's starting down here, what kind of rhythm do you think that is? I'll give you a hint. It starts with V and ends with ventricular. So extreme right axis deviation is actually one of the quickest ways to determine if a wide rhythm is a truly ventricular rhythm. So the picture on the screen, we can really make sense of the 2 thumbs up method, right? So here we have right side, left side. Cool. Electricity goes like this. Boom. Cool. So the reason why I use lead 1, because it's looking this way, it's looking the natural physiologic path of electricity. And so is lead 3. Cool. So is lead 2. Lead 2 for sure. We'll save that for another day because lead 2 plays a lot into axis as well. It tells you a little bit more in depth, really what's going on. But we'll save that for another day. So, and like we were talking about earlier, here's our numbers. So the 0 to negative 30, there's our physiologic left. Negative 30 to 90 or negative 90, there's our pathologic left. Our negative 90 to 180, there's our extreme right axis. And then the 180 to 90, there's our right axis. And then the 0 to 90, there's our normal happy place axis. Cool. So to finish this up, to finish the EKG part up, I want to talk about AVR. It's the forgotten lead. Years ago, when paramedic students, PA students, really anybody was learning about EKGs, years ago, people told them, don't worry about AVR. It's only there because it has to be, right? It doesn't matter. You don't need it. AVR looks directly into the physiologic path of depolarization. So if we go back real quick, look at AVR. It's right here. It's looking at the exact path. It's a transmural view of the heart. And not to mention, but really look where it's looking. It's right here. The aorta, the vena cava, right? Coronary sinus. So where everything starts, AVR is looking right there. And it looks this way. So AVR normally should be negatively deflected, means pointed down. Another cool trick, and we'll get deeper into this sometime with a more in-depth EKG lecture, but another cool trick besides extreme right axis deviation is if AVR is positive, you have a great percentage chance that that rhythm is ventricular. So what purposes do you guys think, just knowing what you know now, what purposes do you guys think that AVR would serve? So if I'll tell you what, I'm going to leave the chat up, but I just want to wrap this part up here for you guys. Just some quick resources that we wanted to throw you guys' way. ECG Weekly, Dr. Amal Mattu, University of Maryland, super smart guy when it comes to EKGs. He has some really cool cases every week. Check them out. Life in the Fast Lane, that's a great resource as well. And then Hansen's Anatomy, they have some awesome artwork as far as anatomy and physiology goes. And they're super kind enough to let us use some of their artwork for some of our work. So I just wanted to give them a shout out as well. If anybody is super into the visual aspect of learning, check them out. Awesome place. So guys, thank you again. If everybody that attended tonight, if you guys don't mind staying on the Zoom, I'm just going to stop the recording here real quick. But for anybody that watches this on YouTube or what have you, guys, check us out, voodoomed.net. Message us anytime, any kind of question that you have. If you want anything posted, what have you, we're an open book, and we'd love to hear from you. So everybody, thanks so much for watching.
voodoomed.net